To understand why a $550 steel arch is turning heads, you need to understand what heating and housing actually cost right now. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the average American household spent well over $2,000 last year just keeping their home warm through the coldest months in parts of the Midwest and the Mountain West. That number climbs even higher because the buildings themselves were never designed to hold heat in the first place. Meanwhile, the cost of a basic backyard shed or a small stick-built cabin has jumped more than 40% since before the pandemic, according to industry lumber pricing data. A simple 200-square-foot structure that once ran a few $1,000s can now cost $15,000 or more once materials, permits, and labor are added up. And that number assumes the permit comes through quickly, which in many counties it does not. A contractor in rural Michigan put it bluntly to a local reporter last year. "People call me wanting a small cabin," he said, "and I have to tell them the permit alone will outlast the winter they're trying to survive." Nearly 4 million Americans currently live in some form of temporary, unfinished, or off-grid structure, whether by choice or necessity, and a growing share of them are doing it through freezing winters with nothing but a space heater and hope. Rural homesteaders, retirees on fixed incomes, young families priced out of the housing market, all of them chasing the same basic thing: for walls that actually hold heat. You have probably driven past one of these setups without realizing it: a trailer with a tarp over the roof, a shed with a stovepipe sticking out the side, somebody's homemade solution to a problem nobody built for them. And while lumber prices climbed and permit offices slowed to a crawl, something else was happening in garages and gravel lots across the country, something that would cost almost nothing and outperform almost everything. This is a story of how one curved sheet of steel, the same shape farmers have used to store grain and hay for 100 years, became the cheapest, warmest shelter a lot of Americans have ever stepped inside, and why the people who noticed first were not government agencies at all, but strangers watching from their phones. The welder from that first video was a man named Dale Kowalski, 34 years old, running a small metal fabrication shop out of a pole barn in rural Ohio. Kowalski has spent 15 years welding grain bins and livestock shelters for farmers around the county, so he understood curved steel better than most contractors ever would. When his own heating bill hit $400 in a single month, he did not call an insulation company. He walked out to a scrap pile. He told a reporter afterward, "I build these things for cows all day. I figured I could build one for myself." Using leftover corrugated panels from a canceled grain bin order, he bent the steel into a simple arch, roughly 10 feet wide and 16 feet long, bolted it to a treated wood floor, and packed the interior with 2 inches of rigid foam insulation left over from another job. A single small window, a steel door salvaged from a job site, and a wood stove vent finished it off. He picked the arch shape on purpose, the same design that lets a grain bin hold its temperature through brutal Ohio winters without any heating system at all. Total cost, $550, almost all the material he already had lying around. He filmed the entire build over a single weekend and posted the video, expecting a few dozen views from other welders. Instead, it crossed 2 million views within 4 days, then kept climbing. People wanted the measurements. People wanted to know if it would hold up in Minnesota, in Maine, in Montana. Comment after comment asked the same question: how is this warmer than my actual house? That is roughly when the county building department noticed. And what came next would decide whether this idea spread any further than one man's backyard. Because Kowalski's structure sat on wheels rather than a permanent foundation, it technically avoided the same permitting rules a stick-built cabin would require. But an inspector who saw the video online flagged it anyway, citing it as an unpermitted dwelling and requesting a formal review. Kowalski was told he might need to remove it or face a fine that would run several times what the entire structure had cost to build. Compare that for a moment to what a code-compliant version of the same square footage would have cost him. A licensed contractor in his county quoted him $15,000 for a permitted, insulated 200-square-foot cabin, with a 6-month wait just to break ground, and no guarantee the design will hold heat half, as well as the arch sitting in his own backyard. Kowalski had built his version, working nights in 1 weekend, for less than 4% of that price, using scraps most contractors would have hauled to the dump. The video that made him briefly famous also made him a target. Neighbors started stopping by to see it in person. A local news station picked up the story, and somewhere in that flood of attention, the letter from the county building department arrived in his mailbox, the last thing a man who had only ever meant to fix his own heating bill expected to find. The backlash online was immediate and loud. Thousands of commenters pointed out that Kowalski's arch sat on wheels, met basic fire safety with its steel shell, and cost less than a used car, while the county wanted to treat it like an illegal apartment complex. A local paper ran the story under the headline, "Man Builds Warm Home for Cost of Vacation, Gets a Warning Instead." Radio hosts picked it up within days. For nearly 2 weeks, the county said nothing publicly, even as calls to the building department climbed into the hundreds and reporters started showing up asking for comment. Kowalski himself stayed quiet, worried that speaking up might make the fine worse rather than better. Then, faced with public pressure and a mailbox full of complaints, the county quietly reclassified the structure as a portable agricultural shed, the same category as the grain bins Kowalski had spent years building, and closed the case without a fine. No apology came with a reversal, just a form letter marking it resolved. Kowalski kept building. Within 6 months, requests for his design plans topped 4,000, and he began selling a simple digital blueprint for $40, along with materials list anyone could take straight to a hardware store or scrapyard. And he was not the only one. In central Michigan, a man named Marcus Reyes had seen Kowalski's video and built his own version, using grain bin panels sourced from a farm auction. His version came in even cheaper, $490, because he skipped the wood stove vent and used a small electric heater instead. "I watched that video maybe 10 times before I picked up a torch," Reyes said later. "I'd never welded anything in my life." Reyes filmed himself holding a thermometer against the interior wall on a 4-degree morning. 68 degrees inside. That clip alone crossed 4 million views, more than Kowalski's original, and pulled in a wave of comments from people in states neither man had ever visited. Between the two of them, plans for the design had now reached homesteaders, retirees, and off-grid families in at least 30 states. What started as one man solving his own heating bill was quickly turning into something neither of them had planned for, and it was about to catch the attention of people with a very different kind of solution in mind. Now, let me tell you about a very different kind of organization, one that had already been working on the same idea for years, just with a sharper focus. In 2019, a group of retired Army engineers in West Virginia founded a nonprofit called Steelroots, built specifically around teaching veterans struggling with housing costs how to weld and assemble their own Quonset-style shelters. The founders, Pete Ambrose and Ray Okafor, had both served overseas and had both watched fellow veterans cycle through housing instability that the usual assistance programs never quite solved. Ambrose later said the idea came to him after visiting a friend still living out of a storage unit 2 years after coming home. Their program was simple. Veterans came in for a 2-week course, learned basic welding and insulation techniques, and left with a fully built art shelter of their own, all for the cost of materials, usually somewhere between $600 and $800. Instructors, all volunteers, donated their weekends without pay. Today, Steelroots has trained and housed over 300 veterans across 4 states, with a wait list stretching into next year. One of those veterans was a former Army mechanic named Jonah Pruitt, after his marriage ended following his second deployment. Pruitt spent almost 2 years bouncing between a cousin's couch and his truck, working odd jobs that never quite covered rent on anything permanent. He heard about Steelroots from another veteran at a VA appointment and signed up mostly out of curiosity. He later said, "I figured I'd learn to weld, and that would be that. I didn't expect to walk out with an actual house." Pruitt built his own arch over 12 days, working alongside 4 other veterans learning the same skills. He parked on a friend's land outside Charleston, added a small solar setup with panels donated by a local church group, and moved in that November. A locked door meant he stopped sleeping with one eye open. A stable address meant he could finally list somewhere permanent on a job application instead of a general delivery box at the post office. For the first time in 2 years, he told his case manager, he woke up somewhere that was actually his. Steelroots was proof that this was not just a viral trend cooling off after a few good headlines. It was becoming infrastructure, one arch and one veteran at a time. And what was happening in West Virginia was only a small piece of something much bigger already forming out west. Here is a detail that separates this design from a plain garden shed, and it has nothing to do with luck. A curved steel arch has no flat walls for wind to push against and no corners for heat to slip out of. Combined with 2 to 4 inches of rigid foam insulation, the shape traps warm air in a continuous loop rather than letting it pool along a flat ceiling and leak out through the seams the way a standard stick-built wall does. Independent testing shared by several builders online has recorded interior temperatures running as much as 65 degrees warmer than the outside air. Using nothing more than a small space heater or wood stove, a gap most insulated cabins twice the price cannot come close to matching. By early 2026, similar arch shelters were being reported in at least 38 states, from Vermont to Arizona, adapted for everything from guest cottages to hunting cabins to full-time homes, and even a handful of small business owners running mobile workshops out of them. Sam Whitfield, the retired mechanic from Montana, added a small solar panel to run his lighting and charge tools along the wash station outside for his dog, a workbench along one curved wall, and a row of pegboard for hand tools, details that had nothing to do with heat retention and everything to do with making the place feel like home rather than a shed. If you want the exact measurements and materials lists several of these builders are using, I put together a free build guide covering 3 different versions, from bare bones to fully finished. The link is in the description below. This is where the design stopped being a backyard curiosity and started being compared, dollar for dollar and degree for degree, against everything the housing industry had been quoting people for years. Now, let me tell you about a stretch of high desert outside Bend, Oregon, because that region might have built the most organized version of this movement in the entire country. Starting in 2022, a collective called Arch and Anchor began hosting community build weekends, turning the same $550 design into a repeatable, almost assembly line process. Volunteers cut and pre-bend the steel panels ahead of time, so a family or individual only needs 2 days on-site to finish insulation, flooring, and a basic electrical setup. The founder, a retired contractor named Louis Farner, had spent 30 years building custom homes before deciding the industry had priced out the very people who needed shelter most. Since forming, Arch and Anchor has completed 214 shelters across Central Oregon, staffed almost entirely by retired contractors, off-grid homesteaders, and local high school shop classes earning credit hours toward graduation. Materials are donated by regional steel suppliers who write the loss off as scrap, and most volunteers keep coming back, drawn by the sight of a family walking into a finished shelter for the first time. Farner put it simply to a local paper. "We're not reinventing housing," he said. "We're just building it the way people used it before it got complicated and expensive." At one weekend event held in a fairground parking lot, over 60 volunteers assembled 11 complete shelters in 2 days, welding, insulating, and wiring each one before families arrived Sunday afternoon to move their belongings in. And the outcomes are holding. Of the 214 households placed since 2022, 94% were still living in their shelter or had moved on to a permanent structure they built themselves 12 months later. Compare that to the state's own emergency housing initiative launched the same year. Oregon allocated $180 million toward prefabricated emergency cabins for rural residents facing housing instability. According to the state's own reporting, only 61% of those units were completed and occupied within 18 months, at an average cost per unit of over $62,000, more than 100 times what Arch and Anchor spend per family, a gap the state's own audit called difficult to fully explain. That contrast tells you everything. A volunteer-run collective working out of a fairground parking lot is placing families faster and keeping more of them housed in a state program with a budget 9 figures larger. The same pattern that showed up with one welder in Ohio and a nonprofit in West Virginia was now showing up at the scale of an entire region, and it was becoming harder for anyone in government to pretend it was a coincidence. The movement has now spread to places you might not expect. Even a handful of small-town libraries in Iowa have started hosting build-your-own-info nights, borrowing the plans free of charge, and inviting a local welder to answer questions. In East Texas, a woman named Carla Whitmore, a retired schoolteacher, built one for $480 using a discounted set of panels from a closed-out farm supply store, and now teaches a weekend class on the design out of her own driveway. "My students range from 22 to 81, she said. Nobody in that room thought they'd ever weld anything. In upstate New York, a church group called Hollow Road Fellowship built 6 shelters for elderly members on fixed incomes, funded almost entirely by a single bake sale and a matching donation from a local hardware chain that had seen the story on the news. In rural Alabama, a teenager named Devin Marsh built one as a solo project for his high school welding class, then sold the plans online for $25 each, using the money to help his family cover their own electric bill through the winter. In Alaska, a homesteading family near Fairbanks reinforced the standard design with an extra layer of insulation and a double-paned window. 72 degrees inside. On a week, the outside temperature never rose above -10. Each version looked slightly different. Some had solar panels, some had wood stoves, some were painted bright colors, and others left bare and rust-streaked on purpose, a badge of honor among the homesteaders trading photos of their builds online. But the bones were always the same: a curved steel arch, a few inches of insulation, and a total cost that rarely crossed $600. What had started with one welder solving his own heating bill in Ohio had, within roughly a year, become a design being adapted from the Gulf Coast to the Arctic Circle, built by people who had never so much as touched a welding torch before watching someone else do it first, then deciding they could figure out the rest as they went. But for every success story, there's a fight with local government. Zoning codes in most counties were written decades before anyone imagined a curved steel arch as a legitimate residence, and many still classify these structures as agricultural buildings, meaning they cannot legally be lived in full-time no matter how warm they run. A permitted, code-compliant cabin still averages $15,000 to $20,000 and a wait of several months. A mini Quonset hut costs $500 to $600 and takes a weekend. That is roughly 3% of price. A few states are starting to notice. Oregon recently opened a pilot program allowing arch-style structures under 400 square feet to be classified as accessory dwellings, cutting the permit wait from months to weeks. Dale Kowalski still lives in the same arch that started all of this, parked behind his shop, heated for pennies a day through another Ohio winter. He never planned to start a movement. He just wanted to stop paying $400 a month to stay warm. If this video showed you something you had not seen before, hit subscribe. I cover stories like this every week, the ones happening quietly in garages and gravel lots long before anyone in charge notices. And there's another one of those stories waiting the video on screen right now, one that starts with a very different kind of shelter, but ends up asking the exact same question. I will see you in that one.